disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the weekend edition, August 22nd and 23rd issue of the Wall Street Journal, weekend edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And actually, today I will be reading from the online version of that. The first article we'll be looking at is in the realm of economy and trade. What's getting hit with the new U.S.-Canada tariffs? U.S. is levying a 50% charge on Canadian imports, including wine, hockey sticks, cement, and paper and textile products. Ottawa pledges retaliation. New tariffs kicked in Saturday on billions of dollars worth of U.S. imports from Canada after trade talks between the two nations collapsed. Canada said it intends to impose retaliatory tariffs starting September 8th, sparking the risk of a wider trade war. Here's what we know about the new levies. Which items will be subject to the new U.S. tariffs? The tariffs announced in late July impose a surcharge of 50% on a long list of Canadian goods. Items subject to the levies include wine, hockey sticks, cement, natural honey, essential oils, and candles. They also include various paper, textile, and electronic products. The White House said at the time that some sectors and goods, including energy, potash, and fish, would be exempt. Unlike previous taxes, the new round of tariffs doesn't exempt exports that comply with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Still, the tariffs on about $20 billion of imports affect only a fraction, about 5% of what the U.S. purchases from its northern neighbor. In 2025, the U.S. imported $383 billion of goods from Canada. Products already subject to tariff under earlier national security measures, including steel, aluminum, auto parts, and lumber, won't be hit by this latest round, the White House said. Why did talks break down? Talks between the two nations had appeared to be going well, leading President Trump to extend the initial deadline for the tariffs. But U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told reporters the talks had failed on Friday night, despite what he described as the administration's willingness to give Canada, quote, the best treatment of any major U.S. trading partner. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said the U.S. proposed new terms in recent days that made reaching an agreement untenable. He didn't provide details, but said the terms involved the treatment of some kinds of automobiles, restrictions on Canada's ability to enter other trade deals, and infringements on Canadian culture and sovereignty. The terms were uneconomic, unfair, and undetermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal, he said. The White House didn't immediately respond to a request for comment on Carney's remarks. What is Canada doing in response? Canada will impose dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs on the U.S., Carney said, and offer support for affected Canadian workers. He said U.S. goods subject to the levies will be concentrated in sectors such as steel, dairy, appliance, agriculture, equipment, paper, and electronics. Full details will be announced in the coming days, he said, and the tariffs will go into effect on September 8th. Responding to a reporter's question about whether Canada was entering a trade war, Carney said, "You're at war when you get attacked. We got attacked." Why did Trump impose the tariffs? The White House said it imposed the tariffs in response to what it described as Canada's discrimination against U.S. goods, citing policies that require companies to invest in auto production in Canada and bans imposed by some Canadian provinces on American liquor products. The two nations have exchanged tariffs for months. Trump last year imposed emergency levies on Canada over its alleged role in the fentanyl trade, though the Supreme Court later deemed those tariffs illegal. He has also taxed Canadian steel, aluminum, auto parts, and lumber on national security grounds. Many Canadian counter tariffs have since been rolled back, although several provinces have maintained their retaliatory bans on U.S. wine and spirits. Does Trump have the authority to impose the new levies? Trump is relying on Section 338 of the Trade Act of 1930, an obscure portion of U.S. trade law. That law allows the president to tax countries that discriminate against U.S. companies, but it has never been used to justify tariffs and could attract legal challenges, experts say. The law is written relatively broadly and appears to have given wide discretion to the president, leading some trade lawyers to believe Trump could be more successful with these levies than with the sweeping global tariffs the Supreme Court struck down in February. Nevertheless, legal challenges to the new taxes could lead to months more uncertainty for businesses and consumers. Election 2026, Politics and Policy. Why Democrats still have a shot at winning the Senate. Michigan and Maine remain question marks, but the party flaunts strength in purple and red states. By Ken Thomas in Washington and Siobhan Hughes in Mitchell, South Dakota. Democrats fighting to win back the Senate from the Republicans spent their summer sweating out a last-minute candidate switch in Maine and the emergence of an anti-establishment progressive in swing state Michigan. The two races remain central to Democrats' hopes of winning back Senate control in the November elections as they try to navigate a narrow pathway to the majority. But even as flipping Maine and retaining Michigan look challenging, Democrats have made headway in defending Georgia, capturing North Carolina, and competing in redder states including Alaska, Ohio, Iowa, and Texas. We have a very good chance to take the majority back, said Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York. He said Democrats had expanded the map and have the strongest map we've had in years, where many states that are purple or even red are now poised to go into the Democratic column. Chart below that shows current Senate seats, Democrats at 47, Republicans at 53. Still, the developments in Maine and Michigan have added some uncertainty to Democrats' plans. A loss in Maine by replacement candidate Troy Jackson against GOP Senator Susan Collins, long and elusive target for Democrats, would represent another missed opportunity in a state that the then Vice President Kamala Harris carried by 7 points in 2024. If Democrat Abdul El Sayed loses the race for the Senate seat in Michigan, it would force the party to flip multiple seats in Donald Trump country. Michigan is clearly the number one pickup for Republicans, and that would really throw a wrench into Democrats' math, said Jessica Taylor, a Senate analyst for the Cook Political Report. Republicans hold a 53 to 47 majority in the Senate, meaning Democrats must gain a net pickup of 4 seats to win back power during President Trump's final 2 years in office. The president's party typically suffers losses in the midterm elections, and Republicans concede their candidates are facing a difficult environment marked by high fuel prices, the war with Iran, and Trump's poor approval ratings. Prediction markets see the odds for control as about even. Surveys show Democratic voters are more enthusiastic about voting in the midterms than Republicans. GOP candidates won't have the benefit of Trump generating higher turnout among infrequent voters when he leads the ticket. And party insiders wonder how Trump might deploy roughly $400 million in his MAGA Inc. super PAC. We've got political headwinds at us. There's no question about it. Some, frankly, economic headwinds, too, that we're facing. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, recently told reporters in South Dakota. So it's not going to be an easy cycle, but we've got really high-quality candidates. They will be well-resourced. In a sign of how the election could be tilting the Democrats' way, the Cook Political Report shifted the Senate campaigns in Texas and Iowa into the toss-up column last week after listing them as lean Republican. Republicans have blamed former President Joe Biden for entrenching high inflation while he was in office, and have warned the Democrats are beholden to far-left policies and the emergence of socialist lawmakers. Democrats want to make the campaign a referendum on Trump, pointing to his inability to rein in the cost of living, the Iran war, and allegations of corruption. Trump remains broadly unpopular. A Pew Research poll last month showed his approval rating at 34%, and the nation has been grappling with 6 months of war with Iran, which has driven up prices for gasoline, fertilizer, and diesel fuel used by truck drivers and farmers who live in many of the Senate battlegrounds. Trump defeated Harris in 4 Republican-leaning states prized by Democrats: Iowa, Ohio, Alaska, and Texas, with at least 54.5% of the vote. Democrats said they were encouraged by Senate nominee Mary Peltola's performance in last week's Alaska open primary, finishing several points ahead of Republican incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan. They will meet again in the fall. Republicans have grown increasingly worried about Georgia, where Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff entered the campaign cycle as one of the most vulnerable Democrats, but has dominated Republican Representative Mike Collins in fundraising and opinion polls. In North Carolina, polls have shown former Democratic Governor Roy Cooper with an edge over Michael Whatley, a former Republican National Committee chairman and Trump ally, in the race to succeed retiring GOP Senator Thom Tillis. GOP strategists, however, hope to counterpunch in New Hampshire, where Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen is stepping down. Former Senator Johnny Sununu, a Republican from New Hampshire, is the leading contender in the September 8th GOP primary to face Representative Chris Pappas, Democrat from New Hampshire, the likely Democratic candidate. Much of the fall campaign might hinge on the outcome in Maine. Democrats view the state as a top target, and party strategists contend they are in a stronger position with Jackson, the former state Senate president, as their nominee after an unusual July convention replaced Graham Plattner on the ballot. Recent polling has shown Jackson, a fifth-generation Mainer with deep union ties, with a slight lead. But Republicans often note that polling in previous Senate campaigns has underestimated Collins' support. First elected in 1996, Collins has emphasized her clout as chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, pointing to ways her position has helped local communities. Republicans had planned to make Plattner's personal story, which included allegations of sexual assault and sexually explicit text messages, a focus of the campaign. He denied the assault allegations. They now plan to mine the voting record of Jackson, a longtime legislator. Jackson is a candidate who has all of the baggage of Graham Plattner and none of the charisma, said Alex Latcham, executive director of the Senate Leadership Fund, the leading GOP super PAC supporting Senate Republicans. Schumer, whose initial pick for the Maine Senate race has been swamped by grassroots enthusiasm for Plattner, saw his exit as a blessing. The only way Collins could win was by making the opponent the issue, as opposed to her. And with Plattner, there are many ways she could do that, Schumer said. But Jackson is so Maine and so part of the fabric of the country, being a logger coming from the North Country, being a union guy, she can't do that. Republicans, meanwhile, view Michigan as a prime pickup opportunity and intend to spend heavily to defeat El Sayed, a progressive former public health official, against former Representative Mike Rogers, who served as House Intelligence Chairman. They intend to use the coming September 11th anniversary to elevate anti-terrorism policies and point to El Sayed's association with Hassan Piker, an influential online commentator who said that America deserved 9/11, according to people familiar with the plans. El Sayed has called it a dumb statement. Schumer and Democratic groups unsuccessfully threw their support behind Representative Haley Stevens in the primary against El Sayed, viewing her as the more electable candidate. But now Schumer backs the nominee and predicted victory. We are really in very good shape, Schumer said. El Sayed has brought in lots of new energy, new people into the party, and a view that he can really get some good things done. Artificial intelligence. Rare book sales are booming. They're getting sliced up and fed to the AI. Sellers are enjoying a jump in sales but fretting over whether irreplaceable books are being sent to the guillotine to train models. By Melissa Korn. James Payne was stumped. The Brooklyn, New York-based rare book seller saw orders surge earlier this year for titles that even he considered to be obscure. By unloading volumes like Home Long-Term Oxygen Treatment in Italy and Marriage Litigation in Medieval England on third-party marketplaces, he has roughly doubled his revenue from this point in 2025. Payne had no idea who was buying these books through Alibris, Biblio, and Amazon.com, and he wasn't alone. Sellers of used books worldwide have been swapping stories of curious sales patterns for months. The buyers went by unusual names including Red Sparrow Project, Blue Finch Project, and Green Parrot Project. They ordered dozens, even hundreds of books at a time on completely unrelated subjects and routed them through logistics warehouses. And they didn't haggle over prices. At first, dealers had practical concerns. How does a small shop that has never packaged an order bigger than 20 books ever ship a batch of 200? And would these brand new buyers pay their bills? Beneath these questions lurked a growing suspicion that the orders had something to do with artificial intelligence companies' insatiable need for new content to train their large language models. As evidence mounted that many of the mystery orders were landing in facilities where books are sliced up, scanned, and destroyed, booksellers were forced to consider their participation in an unusually on-the-nose example of digital technology devouring literary culture. Let's quote Dickens, said Alan Stipek, whose Washington, D.C. area second-story books started receiving bulk online orders this spring. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Second-story sales volume has skyrocketed. The shop, with 75,000 books online and more in store, is in talks to sell directly to one of the bulk buyers. But Stipek is uneasy about the bigger implications, including whether he may be pulling from circulation the last copy of a truly scarce title. These books probably have a purpose that will be totally contradictory to the longevity of my business, he said. Books have long been used to train large language models, the technology underlying systems such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, and Google's Gemini. Anthropic used pirated digital copies of books and also bought physical copies of millions more in bulk, stripped them from their bindings to scan the contents, then destroyed the physical copies, according to court filings in a copyright infringement lawsuit a group of authors filed against the AI company in 2024. The Washington Post reported in detail on the process behind what was known as Project Panama earlier this year. Anthropic agreed to pay $1.5 billion to settle the portion of the case connected to the pirated works. I'd like to pause for a moment to remind you that you are reading or listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A federal judge ruled last year that the material in the books Anthropic bought was fair use under the copyright law, in part because the company's digital versions had only replaced the destroyed print ones and didn't introduce more copies into the market. As AI models grow more sophisticated, the need for additional authoritative data on which to train them has become more urgent, even as the supply of undigested, commercially available writing dwindles. The International Standard Book Number, which provides a unique identifier for each edition of books published since the late 1960s, gives AI firms and vendors that specialize in supplying training data a way of tracking which books they have ingested. The mystery buyer's strong preference for books with an ISBN helped tip off sellers that the bulk buys were tied to the care and feeding of large language models. I think that's where it died. A seller based in the Pacific Northwest took a virtual cross-country journey with her books after noticing more bulk orders earlier this year. She told the Wall Street Journal that she fixed credit card-sized location trackers inside the back covers behind the dust jacket flaps of books and 2 separate shipments in late June and early July. One went to an Ohio warehouse for the marketplace Alibri before heading to an industrial complex in Addison, Illinois, whose address matched a location for a company with a large book scanning business. While some books are scanned for various purposes without losing their spines, so-called destructive scanning is considered more efficient. I think that's where it died, the seller said. The other book went first to a warehouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, then to a spot in northern Las Vegas, at an intersection with at least 2 Amazon facilities. It eventually moved to a position in Mexicali, Mexico. While the seller couldn't determine the exact address, a Google map of the location shows a sprawling, recycled paper manufacturing facility. 404 Media, a tech industry news site, published a story earlier this month saying it had tracked a shipment from a different seller around the country, ultimately to an Amazon facility in Las Vegas known as VGT3. The symbol for that facility, 404 Media reported, was a sharp-toothed green dinosaur holding an open book. In a Reddit forum for Amazon employees, a post from about a year ago described the work done at VGT3. All we do is scan books, the post read. Some are assigned to cut books, and others go to receive, where they get books and scan the barcodes. An Amazon spokesman said the company purchases books through commercial channels to help develop and improve the products and services our customers use. As outrage built this summer over the potential destruction of irreplaceable volumes, Elon Musk said in an X post that he had asked the SpaceX AI team to preserve any rare books in a library and scan them the hard way versus just cutting off the spine and scanning. SpaceX didn't respond to a request for additional comment. An Anthropic spokesperson said sourcing books is a widely used approach for AI training and none of our data acquisition programs buy and destroy rare or antiquarian books. We have to sacrifice the unsigned. Mike Floriani, a Texas divorce lawyer who runs online-only Palos Verdes Books and Ephemera, recently completed large orders that included a textbook about the Russian economy's transition after the fall of the Soviet Union, a Victorian novel, a 2012 Texas Civil Procedure Guide, and a book about a Swedish comedy team popular in the 1960s. Floriani calls these books dead stock, titles that sat on the shelves collecting dust for years. He considered bringing some to the recycling center, which is something many sellers do with books in poor condition or those overrepresented in the used book market. Publishers also recycle unsold overstock. Cultural artifacts, he said, I can categorically tell you that they are not. Floriani hits sales records each of the past 3 months, thanks to bulk orders. As long as the AI companies are recycling the books after scanning them, Floriani said he doesn't have much problem with their activities, provided they aren't violating intellectual property rules. Scott Brown also fulfilled some orders for what he believed at the time were AI-related customers. But the proprietor of Downtown Brown Books in Portland, Oregon, drew the line at an inscribed copy of Ray Bradbury's Futuria Fantasia, a magazine the iconic writer produced as a teenager that was published as a collection nearly 20 years ago. The buyer's shipping information included the word scan in the name. Brown, who reflected on the situation in a recent Substack post, was willing to sell the book. After all, it was listed on a marketplace for $90. But he knew the late owner personally, a customer named Tom, and I know Tom would not want that book sent to the guillotine, Brown told the Journal. He ultimately asked another seller to fill the order with an unsigned copy. If we're going to save the signed copies, we have to sacrifice the unsigned, Brown said. I didn't realize that I saw my job as selling to humans until robots started buying books from me. Russia tests readiness for new round of military mobilization. Turning to the world. Exercises gauge military's ability to absorb mass of new recruits. No decision yet from the Kremlin. By Thomas Grove and Alexander Ward. And then there's a picture of some conscripts called up for military service headed for garrisons in April in the Russian city of Batyatsk. Last month, Russian military officers flew from St. Petersburg to the country's Kaliningrad exclave nestled between 2 NATO countries and the Baltic Sea. There, the officers oversaw readiness planning and procedures for a mobilization of the region's residents, with details on how to house, feed, and arm them, said Western intelligence officials. The planning exercise in Kaliningrad is just one of the many being carried out nationwide, said the officials in case the call is made. The Kremlin hasn't yet made a decision to follow through on any such move, those officials say, and likely won't until after parliamentary elections in late September. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin's determination to take all of eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, despite tiny and costly advances, may force his hand. In recent months, Moscow has failed to recruit enough new soldiers to make up for those killed and injured on the battlefield, while Ukrainian drone advances have reduced the average Russian soldier's lifespan on the front to a matter of minutes, days, or weeks. Those problems and manpower may leave Putin with no choice other than to order a fresh wave of mobilization not seen in years, a U.S. and European official said. Neither the Kremlin nor the Russian Defense Ministry responded to requests for comment. Kaliningrad, the site of mobilization test exercise last month, has become under increased scrutiny recently as Western intelligence officials have warned that it could potentially play a role in Moscow's military planning. Russia, they say, in a potential escalation with the West, could seize part of the adjacent Suwalki Gap, a strip of land that runs from Kaliningrad to Belarus, Russia's ally, through the neighboring Poland and Lithuania. Russia has long seen Kaliningrad's geographic location and tiny population as a vulnerability as well as a useful foothold in Europe. Captured by the Soviet Union from Germany in 1945, it long served as Russia's only ice-free port on the Baltic. Moscow has at times carried out outsized military exercises there as a deterrent to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Allied countries have also responded and in the past week carried out a planned air exercise near the Russian exclave using U.S. and Norwegian fighter aircraft and Polish ground forces. Putin's last mobilization, called in September 2022 to stabilize Moscow's buckling front line, triggered chaos across the country. Hundreds of thousands of men left Russia, leading to a rush on airline tickets and hours-long lines to cross the border into neighboring countries such as Georgia and Kazakhstan. Now, rumors of an impending mobilization in recent weeks and months have caused jitters inside Russia, with men looking online for ways to exit the country in a pinch. Some Russians who have the money to travel have already scoped out destinations for the next few months where they can wait out a potential mobilization. Moscow's Customs Service said last week that the flow of traffic between Russia and Georgia at the Verkhny Lars border checkpoint, which sits on an old Russian Imperial military road, had broken a record with more than 20,000 people crossing in one day. Georgia's Interior Ministry disputed those figures. Property prices have also gone up in recent weeks in places like Georgia and Armenia, partly in anticipation of another wave of Russian immigrants, say real estate agents of both countries. A call to mobilize could help buttress the Russian front line and accelerate Putin's advance on Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the last two major Ukrainian-controlled cities in Donbass. But should it be carried out so late in the year before winter slows fighting, it's unclear what effect the move may have in practical terms. I don't think it'll prove decisive for Russia, and it's actually too late this year, but it could be a factor for 2027, said Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment think tank in Washington. If they have concrete timetables for objectives they want to accomplish this year, like seizing the rest of the Donbass, then they should have mobilized several months ago. Most Russians publicly support the war, and any mass mobilization is unlikely to be met with meaningful unrest. Nonetheless, enthusiasm for it has waned in recent months, according to Russian polling agencies, causing new political strains inside the country. A mass mobilization would also put an enormous financial burden on Russia's already fragile economy. Russia would be further mortgaging its future for the sake of military gain, said Alexander Koliander, a director at the consulting firm Eurasia Group. You need to feed, house, arm, and pay these people, and you take them off the already tight labor market. This will put the budget under immense pressure. Russia's recruitment is still officially voluntary, though authorities are increasingly using strong-arm tactics, manipulation, and even violence to boost numbers at the front. But changes in the way Russia keeps data on its citizens may give the Kremlin the tools to mobilize men more gradually and forego moves that would trigger mass panic. Over the past several years, Russia has compiled a database of all men of military age eligible to serve, and has started alerting those who have to appear at the recruitment office. Russian authorities could boost those alerts to men across the country, raising the number in stages. It's easier for them to cook the frog slowly, calling people up in small numbers, said Alexei Yusupov, Russian analyst at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, a German political think tank tied to the Social Democratic Party. There would be nothing compared to 2022. Since the last mobilization, the Kremlin has tried to convince Russians that it is waging this war responsibly, he said. Upending that sentiment would be dangerous. The fall of Russia's only anti-war party has exposed Putin's vulnerability. Yabloko spent decades censoring itself to survive. The war in Ukraine made continuing that balancing act impossible. By Matthew Luxmore. Russia's token anti-war party, Yabloko, has spent more than 2 decades mastering the art of political survival under President Vladimir Putin. In recent years, it has censored its statements, avoided calls for protest, and zealously guarded its marginal influence. We played it safe, said its co-founder, Grigory Yavlinsky. That's no longer enough. Last week, 1 month before the country's parliamentary elections, the authorities banned Yabloko from the ballot on minor technicalities such as copyright violations and accusations it received financing from abroad. The real reason, according to Yabloko leaders and political analysts, is an unusual surge in the party's support against the backdrop of growing disillusionment with the war in Ukraine it has vocally opposed. Yabloko's disqualification underscores the shrinking space for dissent in Russia and the Kremlin's declining appetite for anything that goes against the official line. That the war is an existential fight to protect Russia from the aggressive Western powers. It comes as Ukrainian drone strikes deepen Russia's already dire economic situation, and a battlefield stalemate in Ukraine fuels frustration with Putin's war. In this context, even Yabloko's Meet Peace platform was too potentially damaging to permit. Abbas Galimov, a former Kremlin speechwriter now living abroad, said the authorities' own internal polling showed that Yabloko has become a vessel for anti-war sentiment and thus a threat. They understood, he said, that the elections would have been a referendum between war and peace. As it campaigned in recent weeks, Yabloko's Instagram account gained 100,000 new followers. Google searches for the party's name, which means Apple, grew 90% in the space of a week. Russia's social media feeds filled up with videos of people biting into apples, lip-syncing to songs about apples, and inking tattoos with their fruit that is the party's symbol. A party that was irrelevant 4 years ago was becoming a cause célèbre. The move to bar Yabloko last week sparked protests. Hundreds of young Russians gathered outside a Moscow courthouse, where Yabloko's bespectacled chairman, Nikolai Rybakov, who has a mop of brown hair and looks like a small-town librarian, spent hours appealing the ruling in vain. Police rounded up some of the protesters, 4 of whom were given brief jail terms. What's striking about Yabloko's ouster from the election is that the party never even planned to enter parliament. Its goal, elements of which were outlined in a 43-word program titled For Peace and Freedom, was simply to influence the discourse enough to expedite an end to the bloodshed in Ukraine, Rybakov said. Yabloko is the only party on the ballot that presents an alternative to the current government compared to the other 10 parties, because there's no difference between the parties currently on the ballot. Absolutely none, Rybakov said in an interview. Its leadership has taken pains to avoid statements calling for a change of regime or anything that may fall foul of Russia's increasingly strict laws on expression. It's an approach that has helped it to survive for decades. Yabloko was founded in the early 1990s during Russia's short-lived experiment with real democracy, when a rambunctious form of politics emerged and dozens of fledgling parties contested power. When Putin came to power in 2000, Yabloko won a spot in a new political system that was designed to sideline real rivals, but permitted, and at times even encouraged, a handful of contenders willing to uphold a facade of fair elections while ultimately towing the government line. Kremlin spin doctors dubbed the system managed democracy, a form of tightly controlled politics that maintains an illusion of competition. A collection of sanctioned parties, including Yabloko, was allowed to push harmless policy ideas, but never allowed to cross the line into actual dissent. The genuine opposition that fought to shed light on corruption and organized protests against Putin, spearheaded for many years by anti-corruption crusader Alexei Navalny, was met with police batons, jail terms, and exile. Navalny himself was poisoned by the authorities and later died in an Arctic prison. Yabloko was for decades a core part of this make-believe politics. It advocated for greater freedoms and rules of law, even as those notions fell increasingly out of favor with the populace willing to embrace a strongman ruler to end the post-Soviet economic malaise. But systemic parties such as Yabloko, and that's spelled Yabloko, were always cogs in a carefully calibrated machine that could, at any point, fall apart. If things start to go badly with the ruling party and with the status quo in general, and such parties get genuine electoral support, they may start to morph into something quite different, said political scientist Ekaterina Shulman. In the past, if a party or a candidate was deemed a threat, authorities would simply refuse to register them ahead of time, citing issues with their paperwork or some other procedural law. When Navalny launched a nationwide political campaign for the 2018 presidential election, he was quickly barred. The same fate befell the sole anti-war candidate who ran against Putin in 2024, Boris Nadezhdin. Russians had flocked in large numbers to campaign for the uncharismatic bureaucrat with no previous political platform. Nadezhdin has since left Russia, saying he feared jail time. Yabloko was initially allowed to contest this year's vote because the authorities wanted to show that few Russians were willing to back an anti-war party, said Galimov. Putin sought to rally support for a continuation of the war, and every other party backed him. United Russia, the ruling party, pledged its commitment to the military campaign. The head of Russia's Electoral Commission, Ella Pamfilova, said casting your vote means making your own modest contributions to victory. None of that worked. Yabloko kept rising in the polls. This situation prompted a standoff between Kremlin officials managing the country's tightly controlled elections and hardliners afraid that permitting an opposition force was risky, Galimov said. In the end, the latter camp won out. Yabloko is still allowed to field dozens of candidates in regional elections happening in parallel with the national vote. In an interview, Rabikov said the party would focus on those races and was careful not to voice any overt criticism of Putin, but he predicted a dark outlook for politics in the country. He reeled off the names of 7 party members now serving jail sentences for speaking out against the war. Rybakov's deputy, Lev Schlossberg, a veteran politician in the city of Pskov near Ukraine, was sentenced this week to 11 years in prison for speaking out against Russian armed forces. Another party created by Kremlin spin doctors 6 years ago is likely to take Yabloko's place on the national ballot. It's called New People, and its program is a set of cliché slogans such as not revolution, but evolution. Galyamov, the former Kremlin speechwriter, said that banning Yabloko may prove risky for the Kremlin. By depriving Russians of a safe outlet for their frustration in the form of an anti-war party sanctioned by the state, it not only shows its fear of dissent, but also allows that frustration to fester. The authorities seem to be fully in control of the official political sphere. It looks like nothing threatens them, Galyamov said, but the more strength the regime tries to outwardly project, the weaker its real position actually is. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Middle East. Iran's top politicians urge an end to the war. President and parliamentary speakers say Tehran needs to negotiate an exit and shore up its economy while it has leverage. By Andrew Dowell. Dubai. Iran's top politicians said the country needs to focus on ending the war and shoring up its crippled economy, pushing back publicly against hardliners who are taking a more defiant approach in the 6-month-old conflict. The comments by Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf come as the diplomatic track remains stalled, and the Trump administration has shifted to a policy of ratcheting up economic pressure via sanctions and the naval blockade of Iran's ports. The war and the economic strictures have piled pressure on Iran's already spiraling economy, further sinking its currency and making it hard for Iranians to afford their daily needs. Tehran's more moderate leaders worry the pressure will eventually undermine the country's stability. It is unclear, however, whether hardliners who recently levied tough new demands for reopening the Strait of Hormuz or the Trump administration, which is demanding deep concessions and called again this week for the regime's collapse, can come to an agreement. The war must come to an end at some point, Pezeshkian said Friday in comments reported by the Iranian media. It is better that we demonstrate our strength and dignity today and tell the world that we have won and that we are ending the war. Ghalibaf was less direct, but said there will be no security if the country ignores its economic crisis. No matter how much military power we have, if our people are struggling and the country lacks financial circulation and economic growth, we will not achieve progress, the parliamentary speaker said. As someone who has experienced war, we understand the true value of peace. Analysts saw the comments as notable expressions of Iran's economic distress, but said that further rounds of escalation are more likely than end to the war given the current lack of viable parameters for the deal. Iranian hardliners have a deep distrust of the U.S. administration and have taken the lull in the conflict to prepare for more rounds of fighting. President Trump has made his eagerness to strike a deal clear throughout the war, but the memorandum of understanding he signed in June to wind down the war collapsed over Iran's attempts to govern traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, and talks earlier this month similarly stalled when the U.S. refused to do a deal that didn't promise unimpeded traffic through the waterway. Both deals were criticized in the U.S. as too favorable to Iran, putting pressure on the administration to take a tougher line. They would love to make a deal, but they're not ready to make the right deal, Trump told reporters Friday. Iran analyst Hamidreza Azizi said Trump appears to be gearing up to leverage Iran's economic troubles to demand deeper concessions. That pressure, however, makes it harder for Iran to avoid a humiliating climb down. This is creating a vicious circle, Azizi said on social media. Danny Citronowicz, the former head of the Iran division of Israeli Defense Intelligence, said Friday that neither side seems ready to make the necessary compromises. For that reason, despite the signals coming from Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian, the probability of escalation is currently increasing rather than decreasing, he wrote on social media, using an alternative transliteration of the parliamentary speaker's name. Turning now to opinion, weekend interview. Why the welfare debate went silent? What's the best way to aid the poor? The question used to roil American politics. If only it still did. By Barton Swaim, Bloomington, Indiana. The reasons for the Democratic Party's lurch toward radicalism, which began in earnest in 2019 and continues apace, are many and complex. Among them is one I proposed in 2020, that modern liberalism has accomplished nearly everything it set out to do and has few remaining ideas. Liberalism, in this sense, aims to redistribute wealth more fairly and expand rights to new constituencies. But redistributionism has reached its limit in U.S. politics, and to expand rights, today's liberals, now mostly called progressives, have to invent classes of persons who supposedly lack rights, hence the trans community. In the absence of any great liberal cause, young left-leaners search for excitement and collectivism, the abolition of police and prisons, and anti-Israel mania. One liberal cause deserves a revival: welfare reform. From the New Deal through the Great Society to the present, liberal policy has conspicuously failed to accomplish its stated aims. Tally up all federal, state, and local anti-poverty programs, from Medicaid and food stamps to your local utility assistance programs, and Americans spend nearly $2 trillion a year on welfare. Yet any mildly observant person driving through a subsidized housing complex can see that system's ineffectuality. Most people associate the phrase welfare reform with Republicans and conservatives, but the last major reform to the American welfare state was the result of a Democratic president's advocacy and signature. Later this year, Bill Clinton said in his first address to Congress in 1993, "We will offer a plan to end welfare as we know it. I know from personal conversations with many people that no one wants to change the welfare system as badly as those who are trapped in it. We have to end welfare as a way of life and make it a path to independence and dignity." On August 22, 1996, exactly 30 years ago, Mr. Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Nearly all Republicans supported that bill. And 123 Democratic lawmakers, 98 in the House, 25 in the Senate, also voted aye. The reform mostly limited itself to a New Deal program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Federally funded but run by the states, AFDC, known until 1962 as Aid to Dependent Children, was meant originally for widowed moms, but grew into a vehicle for underwriting unwed motherhood. The 96 reform required recipients of aid to work out or document a search for work. It also introduced a lifetime limit of 5 years, hence AFDC's name changed to Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. A modest alteration in the scheme of things, the law moved millions of people off the dole and into the workforce, defied widespread predictions of increased penury, and contributed to the late 1990s boom economy. Yet exactly 0 Democrats today would dare speak of welfare and dependency the way Mr. Clinton did 3 decades ago. This, although the 1996 law's work provisions have all but disappeared, and the country's ganglion of aid programs discourage work as effectively as their forerunners did in the 1980s and early 90s. As for Republicans, they can fulminate against 30-something able-bodied males playing video games in their parents' basement, but few show a principled concern for the plight of people caught in the closed circle of subsidized existence. Washington's political class seems satisfied with a return to the status quo ante 1996. Perennial unemployment and associated ills haven't gone away, but the capacity to care about any of it has. What happened? Leslie Lankowski, a professor emeritus of public affairs at Indiana University, thinks part of the answer has to do with the idea of inequality. The poverty line, developed first by the economist Molly Orshansky in the 1960s, was a fixed line, he tells me in a room of the Lilly Library at IU. You calculate some measure of living expenses, food, and so on, and if you don't have that, you're below poverty. For all its problems, there's some objectivity to a poverty line. Yet many on the left think poverty is a relative factor and should be measured as a percentage of, say, median or mean income, or some average set of living expenses. By that measure, as society gets wealthier, the poor and even the middle class appear to get poorer, even if their actual material conditions improve. You want to make really sure the poor you will always have with you, Mr. Lenkowsky says. Adopt a relative standard of poverty. It'll never change. Mr. Lenkowsky sums up Winston Churchill's favorite social policy as a ladder on which all may climb and a net beneath which none may fall. A net is a fixed thing, Mr. Lenkowsky says. Once you make it a relative standard, you're not talking about a safety net. You're talking about refashioning society. In 1996, Mr. Lenkowsky was president of the Hudson Institute, which influenced the Wisconsin reforms on which the 1996 federal reform was based. And before that, he was an assistant and friend to the Democratic intellectual and politician Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who lived from 1927 to 2003, who served as a U.S. Senator from New York from 1977 to 2001. It was Moynihan who in 1965 offended the liberal cognoscenti by arguing in a Labor Department report titled The Negro Family that federal welfare policy worked against family cohesion and thus ensured black economic regress. What Pat showed in that report, Mr. Lenkowsky, who was Moynihan's doctoral student at Harvard, referred to him in the familiar fashion, was that higher black employment didn't lead to less welfare disbursement. It rose in tandem with welfare, which is the opposite of what everybody at the time assumed. Moynihan's report earned its author severe criticism from the left, but as its subtitle reminds us, The Case for National Action, it didn't propose ending or even cutting welfare. It didn't offer solutions at all, but urged policymakers to rebuild the welfare state in a way that would fortify the black family and encourage men, then overwhelmingly the breadwinners, to stay in the workforce. No such rebuilding happened, but Moynihan's belief that reform was possible lived on. Mr. Lenkowsky relates his old boss's decision, shocking his liberal friends a second time, to work for President Richard Nixon as a domestic policy advisor. The chief outcome of Moynihan's White House sojourn was a bill to establish the Family Assistance Plan. The FAP would have supplied non-taxable money to poor families when their income fell below a certain level. The free market economist Milton Friedman had proposed a related idea, the negative income tax, but disavowed the FAP on grounds that it contained too many perverse incentives. Both Moynihan and Friedman, though, envisioned their plans as replacing the American welfare state, not adding to it. I'd like to pause for a moment to remind you that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The FAP effectively died in the Senate, Mr. Lenkowsky says. Liberals like George McGovern thought it too stingy, and Southern Democrats like Russell Long weren't interested in handing Nixon a policy victory. Some Republicans favored the Moynihan Plan, others opposed it because they realized Congress had no inclination to cut redundant programs. In 1975, Congress created the Earned Income Tax Credit on a similar idea, but no other program got the axe. The reform impulse next manifested itself in a Republican-controlled Wisconsin in the 1990s. Governor Tommy Thompson had a reputation as a critic of welfare, Mr. Lenkowsky recalls. The legislature said, okay, you're such a critic, we'll abolish virtually the whole program and let's see what you can do to replace it. Asked for help by Mr. Thompson's health department, Mr. Lenkowsky flew to Madison and invited people from the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee on the right and from the Joyce Foundation in Chicago on the left. We really had a bipartisan group there, he says, and that's how we came up with the Work First idea. Before, when someone would apply for welfare, that person would go to a government office, have his eligibility verified, and take a check. Under Work First, you were first put in a work assessment, and if you were assessed eligible to work, that set in motion a process to get you in the labor force with a time limit on receipt of public assistance. The Wisconsin reform led almost immediately to Mr. Clinton's 1996 federal reform bill. But don't I remember that Senator Moynihan denounced the bill? You are right, said Mr. Lenkowsky, and there were complicated reasons for it. Relations between Moynihan and the Clintons soured early in the president's first term when an anonymous staffer told Time magazine the administration would roll over Moynihan if he got in the way of its domestic agenda. But there were philosophical reasons for Moynihan's opposition too. Like Friedman, and for all their disagreements, Moynihan championed an income strategy of giving the poor financial assistance, Mr. Lenkowsky says. Pat fully subscribed to the view, as JFK economic advisor James Tobin once put it, that AFDC was an insane piece of social engineering. Moynihan wanted to look for ways to provide money that would not have the dependency-inducing effects that AFDC and food stamps had. The risk that the poor would spend cash foolishly, but being told how to spend it by a bureaucracy has its own ill effects on personal responsibility. Also, the bureaucracy costs a lot. Mr. Clinton's 1996 welfare reform, in Moynihan's view, marked the triumph of the services strategy of poor relief. Pat used to call it feeding the sparrows by feeding the horses, building a layered and expensive governmental system to manage the poor out of poverty. In the 1996 bill, Mr. Lenkowsky says spending on cash assistance to the poor was capped, but funding for services aimed at remedying disadvantages has grown by leaps and bounds. So too has means-tested aid, food stamps, Medicaid, and so on, which limit what the poor can buy. Liberals, most notably President Clinton, who called for the bill, and then Senator Joe Biden, championed that approach, Mr. Lenkowsky continues. Conservatives agreed with Moynihan that the welfare state superstructure had spun out of control and needed replacement more than reform. But they supported Mr. Clinton's reform because it at least pulled back on some profligacy and imposed work restrictions. Mr. Lenkowsky, who years before had assisted Moynihan on his book about the Family Assistance Plan, The Politics of Guaranteed Income, 1973, visited his friend in 1996 to urge him to vote for the reform bill. He wouldn't budge. The debate over welfare policy that roiled American politics for more than 3 decades, roughly from Moynihan's 1965 report to the end of the 20th century, has now gone quiet. And not because the problems have solved themselves. I have to wonder if it's because, thanks to 70 years of economic growth, today's below-poverty family lives far more prosperously than its counterpart of the 1960s or 70s, and today's political class has tacitly decided to leave things as they are. But suppose a politician wanted to restart the argument about welfare and its effects. What might he try? Mr. Lenkowsky would like to hear someone make the case for cashing out a welfare program. Get rid of some services, bureaus, or at least cut them back, and put cash into people's hands instead. A related point, maybe somebody could revive the idea of consolidating welfare agencies. Mr. Lenkowsky recalls running AmeriCorps under President George W. Bush in the early 2000s. The president, acting on his MBA instincts, wanted to know how many programs in the federal government were directed at disadvantaged young people. One of Mr. Lenkowsky's aides at AmeriCorps chaired the task force. They identified 300, he recalls. This was in 2003. 300 separate programs that, to one degree or another, were aimed at helping the same population. I'm sure it's grown by now. Eventually, in discussing how the American polity might again address the question of poverty, Mr. Lenkowsky comes to the point nearly all such conversations come to these days. I mean, obviously, he says with a gesture of resignation, we'd need much better political leadership than we have today. Declarations. The Art of the Self-Deal. Thoughts on how Trump-era corruption is affecting Americans as a people, by Peggy Noonan. I'm thinking about the deeper effects of governmental corruption in the Trump era and why it leaves many not only indignant but uneasy. I suspect it's doing something to us as a people. The thoughts were prompted by a poll this week by Reuters Ipsos, which Reuters headlined, "Most Americans believe Trump has inappropriately profited since returning to power." It reported that 69% of respondents see his personal business interests as influencing presidential decisions. 2/3 of independents, half of Republicans, and 9 of 10 Democrats share that view. Republicans, God bless them, were split on whether graft under Mr. Trump has gotten worse or better or stayed the same, which makes that polling question a case study in how bright people are capable of not seeing what they don't want to see. We'll quickly posit what we mean by Trump-era corruption. I see 2 general areas: personal enrichment and the use of government to satisfy private goals. The personal enrichment part is suggested by recent and frequent reports showing that Mr. Trump's net worth and that of his family has surged dramatically in his second term. This isn't just wealthy folks seeing their stocks go up. Trump businesses have developed positions in industries over which the administration exercises power. Some were in cryptocurrency, and there is the Trump meme coin, some of the largest buyers of which have been given access to the president, some at a dinner at one of his golf clubs. A Washington Post analysis suggests roughly half may be foreign-based. The Journal has reported that representatives of Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi agreed to purchase 49% of a Trump crypto entity for $500 million. Sheikh Tahnoun is not only a businessman, but a senior member of the United Arab Emirates ruling party and its national security advisor. This newspaper also reports that Mr. Trump made many millions licensing his name to overseas property developers, including developers in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Oman. These are items in a longer possible list, but are representative of the administration's general approach. The size and means of this enrichment would seem dubious, careless of appearances, appalling. As to the use of governmental power to achieve not public but personal goals, including revenge and punishing enemies, there have been numerous reports, it feels like a new one every day, of bending, testing, or getting around the law to make the administration's friends happy and enemies sad. This has included paying people in Mr. Trump's orbit to lobby for presidential pardons. This newspaper has done great work there, launching strange investigations and muscling law firms and media companies. Republicans seem generally not to have found the last alarming, which is alarming. You don't like Jimmy Kimmel? I don't like Jimmy Kimmel. He's boorish, crude, tinnily self-valorizing. But defending speech when it's muscled by government? Yes, of course. Governments are worse than networks because the former have the power to crush you, and you only get one at a time, and you can't change the channel except every 4 years. Be on the side of the information flow, even when it's full of sludge. Be on the side of the voice, not on the big crushing thing. Conservatives used to know to fear government and beat it back. An odd thing about all this is the absence of furor. There is no broad public outcry. Why? Because corruption is a constant and the other side is dirty too. Response. Because the scandal threshold has skyrocketed. President Trump walked into history dragging a long tail of litigation, accusation, and lawsuits behind him. He never sold himself as a man of moral rectitude, and most supporters didn't think that's what they were buying. Jimmy Carter shaking down the system to see what coins fall out would have been news. Donald Trump's doing the same is Tuesday. And there's the sheer scale. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. Scandals add up and become a blur, not a call to action. But the country pays a cost for all this. Institutionally, everything happening today sets a precedent. Every abuse we accept widens the range of possible misbehavior for the next administration. Corruption is more dangerous, has a more deteriorating effect than bad policy. Bad policy can be reversed. Corruption works its way into a system and changes its nature. Suppose a Republican president leaves office having established that a president can use regulatory powers against antagonistic institutions, exert pressures on companies needing government approval, and demand personal loyalty throughout the executive branch, all with no lasting repercussions. The next administration, disposed in other ideological directions, inherits the precedents. It says turnabout is fair play. An Ocasio-Cortez administration wouldn't have meme coins and golf resorts. It would look much cleaner. Progressives usually aren't set on personal cash. They're set on institutional power. They would privately thank Mr. Trump for proving restraints on executive power are weaker than previously thought and publicly claim that finally we have a president who advances the public interest. But I suppose the larger threat of government corruption is that it hurts the public's morale, its sense of seeing itself as a moral actor to whom politicians have to answer. Our entire system of government assumes a citizenry that polices its politicians, that says, you can't do that, this office isn't yours, your powers were lent to you for public purposes. If the public shrugs and looks away, Americans will lose the habit of thinking of themselves as entitled to a clean government, and they'll have to admit they surrendered their own views to the views of the tribe. It is public's role to uphold Republican standards. In the past, a politician caught selling an office, taking money from interested parties, using governmental machinery for personal revenge, was supposed to fear not only legal action but disgrace. Citizens derive a certain dignity from believing that we enforce the rules. It reminds them who's in charge, them. You're giving up a lot when you give that up. In times of corruption, good people who might run for office don't. They think they can't survive in that world. Bad people, those with limited internal ethical and moral structures, are encouraged. Politics is a way to get rich and famous, to push people around. They are elected, govern badly, corruptly, and the cycle continues. Unchecked corruption tells cynics not that they have an uninteresting flaw, but they are realists. Never tell cynics that. It gives them license. As always, the whole world is watching.
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.